Callum stared out at the mixed group of mages and dragons. Despite his original misgivings, things were actually coming along. He had to admit Courtney might have been right about them needing to work together. All the same, he doubted it would make that much of a difference when push came to shove. But at least Courtney was proving that not all mages were all bad. He could give her that much credit. A smaller dragon flew low overhead, buzzing in trees. He made a mental note to reprimand the youngling, out of sight of the others. This was serious business, and there was no room for playing. He didn't miss the startled look of the mage riding the fledgling beast. The Dragon Lord smiled in some grim satisfaction. At least it was showing these mages just where they stood in the grand scheme of things.
You know,
Courtney spoke up as she made her way over to his location.
all work and no play isn't always the best thing.
She hadn't missed his look of exasperation at the one dragon's antics.
But I can understand why you're pushing them so hard. Margot did the same to me before the battle to open the mountain. She told me the enemy wouldn't care if I was hurt or dying. They'd just keep coming.
Callum had to admit to sharing the same philosophy.
Kata Margot was a wise woman.
He conceded.
I am almost sorry she is not with us now.
The young mage shook her head. It was the second time he'd said something at least bordering on praise for the former Kata. She supposed it was the best she was going to get out of him, too.
Do you think it will change things when the others get back?
With a somewhat condescending look, Callum returned her gaze.
If they are successful in finding a group of mages I do not believe exists,
He answered in a terse tone.
Kern believes.
Courtney countered. And though the Nirim had explained the reasons for Callum's distaste for mortals, she still couldn't understand it. But hadn't she had her own reasons to fight alongside Anwen and Tyler? And for what she'd done before even meeting Anwen? People often did things that hurt others because they themselves were in pain. At least that's how she'd reacted in the past, inflicting hurt because she didn't feel secure in her own abilities. She supposed it was the nature of life in general, mortal and immortal, though it was nice to know it wasn't just her.
Would it be so wrong to hope as well?
Callum didn't deign to answer that as he moved to reprimand a team of mages and their dragon counterpart. He strode away with deliberate steps, signifying the matter was closed, at least for now. With a sigh, Courtney went back to the groups she was supervising. They still needed work on communicating with each other. She was determined to figure out a way to help fix that problem, by nightfall, if at all possible. None of them seemed to have a talent for anything resembling soul speech. Maybe it was just as well. Anwen woke with a start as the car stopped. She blinked sleep from her eyes. Her tired mind tried to determine if she recognized the buildings outside the car window or not. They looked somewhat familiar, she decided. If she didn't know any better, she'd guess they'd reached Palos.
What time is it?
She asked as she rubbed at her eyes. It was still dark out. Tyler leaned back from his position in the front passenger seat.
Just after 3 in the morning.
He answered.
We had to stop for gas, but should reach our destination in another couple of hours. Did you need something?
She shook her head as Walter got out and began pumping the gas. After their earlier stop in Tawny Falls, she didn't think they needed anything food-wise. Part of her wouldn't mind a good shower, though. It wasn't the first time she'd had to do without, but she knew she'd want one sooner than later. Several minutes later, Walter slipped back into the driver's seat.
Yep, we're good to go.
He announced as he put on his seatbelt. The car started with a purr and he gave an appreciative nod.
Oh, yes. Now that's more like it.
Tyler rolled his eyes at the man's antics. While he did have a certain appreciation for cars, Walter took it to another level. He knew Walter drove an old beat-up truck. He also knew the man hoped for something a little sportier, but didn't have the money for it. This was the next best thing. Anwen felt a cold chill run down her spine as they drove back onto the main road. They were now passing an older shopping center. The pavement lay cracked on many places, with old lights leaning over the whole parking lot. The glass windows of the store needed a good washing, but that wasn't what caught her off guard. Images flashed behind her eyes, images of a cold, rainy night when she was still a child. An umbrella that wanted to fly away with the breeze, a loud explosion in the night as a bullet flew from a pointed barrel.
Hey.
Tyler said, calling her back to the present.
You okay?
Since they weren't going quite up to speed yet, he unbuckled himself. Ignoring Walter's protests, he crawled into the back seat to be next to her. Anwen shivered next to him. She gave a sort of nod towards the store they were passing, eyes misting with suppressed emotion. Her throat felt thick and she wasn't sure if she could trust her voice.
That's where it happened, isn't it?
Tyler asked as he slid one arm behind her shoulders and pulled her towards his chest.
That's where your father died.
He didn't even have to guess to know, though her slight nod was helpful in confirming it. Walter glanced back in the rearview mirror, not sure if this was a private moment or not. He'd only briefly heard what had happened, but to see the actual location, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the first time since then that she'd seen the place, and if so, had they moved to avoid seeing it after what had transpired. Tyler smoothed Anwen's hair as the tears leaked from her eyes. It was too soon after the death of her mother, and now to have this reminder of how her father had died, chances were good it was too much for her. He soothed, lulling her into a sense of security as he held her in his arms. Exhaustion finally won and Anwen's eyes slid closed. Tears stained her face, tracing down her cheeks in silence. Tyler wiped them away with a fingertip before leaning back and letting out a sigh.
I should have realized something like this would happen.
He admitted.
It was bound to happen at some point.
Streetlights flashed as they drove past them and out of the city limits.
You know, it doesn't matter how many times.
Walter spoke up over the silence. His voice was soft, almost as though he were afraid to wake her.
There will always be an emotional connection to that place for her. One that will bring back sad memories.
Tyler couldn't help but look up with shrewd eyes.
Yeah.
He agreed, giving up on finding whatever he hoped to see. Walter was just as good at keeping secrets as he was.
I can't help but wonder how much more she can take before she breaks.
Walter bit his lip at that comment, remembering his conversation with Anwen only a few nights ago. Perhaps she had already broken and was struggling to pick up the pieces. She was likely still pretending she was stronger than she felt. If so, he didn't blame her. It had been one thing after another, with no real stop. She had every right to break down, but it was her tenacity to get back up every time that he felt more telling.
Try to get some sleep.
The veteran advised his draconic friend.
I have a feeling you're gonna need it.
He turned his attention back to the road. Someone had to navigate down the lone stretch while his passengers dozed off in the back seat. When Anwen next woke up, all she saw was trees. They stretched out for as far as the eye could see. They weren't the mountain variety either. These weren't ancient oaks and the like, reaching high to the heavens. Their smooth trunks extended to heights she could only gawk at. There were no pines here, at least not that she could see. Tyler had insisted on trading with Walter so he could get some sleep before they'd hit the forest. Walter had dozed off in the front seat long before they had to stop. The track, a narrow dirt path, became more broken the further it went. Upon seeing Anwen was awake, Tyler cleared his throat to wake the veteran as well.
Well, looks like we have another long trek from here.
He mused.
Though I have no idea what direction we should go.
Anwen rubbed sleep and dried tears from her eyes. Part of her felt ashamed for losing it earlier, but Tyler didn't say anything, so she tried to push that feeling aside.
Where are we?
Walter woke after a nudge from Tyler. He made some funny noises as he came to.
Oh, right.
He sighed, realizing everyone was finally up.
I think we're lost.
She admitted as she unfastened her seatbelt. She reached for the map lying open in her lap. There was nothing to indicate their current position.
We're in the Forest of Mora.
Tyler corrected, though he wasn't sure which part. Dense undergrowth emerged not too far from their current location. He admitted to some surprise that the rough track hadn't woken Anwen earlier, but he supposed she needed the rest. Emotional ordeals tended to take a lot out of a person, and she'd had more than her fair share of them as of late. Stretching, Anwen got out of the car and headed for the trunk. Chances were good they'd have another cold breakfast. Not that she minded. They'd all gotten used to it. So instead of complaining, she pulled a few granola bars out of her pack.
Any idea which way we should go? It all looks the same to me.
From overhead, they could make out the light of day, though the sun was hidden from view. She supposed Tyler might be able to tell the direction of the sun from the way the shadows fell. and from there the direction they might head. But she knew she couldn't. There was a trick to it, she supposed. It had to be something like looking for moss growing on a certain side of a tree or something. Even with that logic, she couldn't see any moss around to check. Maybe it was on the other side of the trunks.
We could wander for days in here.
Walter observed as he joined her on a fallen log.
Why did I even think this would be a good idea?
At least Tyler hadn't tried plowing through the trees. Tyler laughed.
It's not that hopeless.
He reprimanded.
The trail we're on still goes on a ways. We can follow that one and see where it takes us. If it runs out, well, then we could just keep going. We'll mark our paths as we go, so we can find our way out again.
Anwen closed her eyes, already feeling the wariness creep into her bones.
This could take forever.
She moaned. She momentarily forgot that if anyone had any idea where to find these so-called lost mages, it was her.
I guess we do what Tyler suggests.
She didn't see too many other options, realizing she was at the mercy of her guides.
I'm more worried about how we prove you're the Kata to them once we find them.
Tyler admitted.
How we're gonna convince them to come back with us. It's not like they can all fit in our car.
He gave the vehicle a sidelong look. Even if he transformed back into his dragon form, he couldn't carry them all, regardless of how many there were. He hoped there were more than just a handful left. After a quick breakfast, Tyler hefted his pack, taking the lead. The others fell in step behind him as he followed the trail ahead of them. It only seemed natural to let him lead since he'd done so far for most of their time together. That and the trail seemed easy enough to follow. None of them had any idea of the lay of the land, so they stayed close together. Birds called out from the trees, occasionally showing themselves as they flew away. Creatures rustled in the brush and threw the dead leaves on the ground. At least the woodland animals left them alone. Perhaps they sensed the presence of a dragon, who could easily swat them aside like a gnat. Either way, it made the going a bit easier as the track decreased in size to a simple overgrown path. From there, it became merely a trickle of exposed, hard-packed earth on a narrow line. Tyler put up one hand to signal them to silence as he made an abrupt stop. He peered around their location. His eyes narrowed as he searched for whatever it was that had caught his attention. His skin prickled with energy as he realized something was amiss. Anwen blinked at this unusual behavior, not sure what to make of it. She felt a similar sense of something out of the natural order, though she couldn't place it. The last time something like this had happened, she was on the boat before the landslide. Thinking this might be similar, she closed her eyes to shut out any other stimuli and listened. Shh, 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 shh. She heard the branches overhead whispering to each other. The air seemed to barely move at all as a bird fluttered into flight from further in. She turned her head to listen in that direction. The whole forest had an expectant feeling, like something might happen at any moment. It reminded her of the pregnant pause before a storm broke loose. Hush, hush. But what was making that sound? She couldn't tell. It wasn't the trees, brush, or anything else around. It almost felt like a spell of sorts, casting out nets of silence on the area around them. Subconsciously, Anwen reached out a hand towards the strongest concentration of silence. Something, or someone, didn't want to be found. Fingers spread as her palm faced the ground and the Kata opened her eyes. They glowed liquid gold.
Show yourselves.
A twig broke and the web of silence shattered. Multiple presences came into existence as shrouds were shredded. The air seemed to sigh as Anwen's two companions looked around.
We're definitely not alone,
Tyler confirmed when Walter looked his way. More brush crackled as whoever was out there made their way to the path. The sounds were muted, though, as if from skilled woodsmen. Despite that, the three travelers could hear them as plain as day. Anwen continued to hold her hands out. It seemed as though she were commanding the air around them to magnify the sounds coming from the forest. Walter couldn't help but spin around as a bird cawed louder than he'd expected. The creature was still some distance away, though, and wasn't likely to harm them.
What in the world was that?
He whispered, though it sounded like the roar of a train in his head.
I think that's enough.
Tyler called out to Anwen in soul speech. Anwen blinked, her eyes returning to their normal hue as she lowered her head. The noise dimmed considerably, much to Walter's relief. Despite this, they could still hear faint rustling in the trees as a score of women moved to surround them.
Who dares enter the Wood of the Mages?
One of the women demanded as she moved to stand in the path, blocking them from further progress.
Not many come this way, and those who do pay the price. There are but a few who can countermand the spells we use. Who are you?
She gazed on them with a scrutinizing look, like she could see into their souls. Tyler was about to take a step forward when Anwen beat him to it.
I dare.
She said, doing her best to act like her mother. Margot would have been fearless in the eyes of a stranger, not showing any weakness. It wasn't as hard as she'd thought it would be, pretending. Even with this woman threatening them by her mere presence. It was a little harder to keep her knees from quaking, though, even if she could keep her voice steady. The woman raised a brow in mild surprise.
You? And who are you to be so bold? We do not recognize you, nor can we glean anything of who you are. How is it you are able to hide yourself so completely from us?
Heart thudding, Anwen didn't dare back down, no matter how intimidating these people were. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the other women around them. Some were holding bone knives, not unlike the one Courtney wielded, and those who didn't have such a knife felt as though they didn't need one. She took a deep breath, deciding the best thing to do was to try and put them off their guard.
Where have the mages gone? They follow the walker, divided to protect their future. They now wander. The guide that has gone, clues to follow. Find the mages and bring them home.
Her words seemed to bring their confronter up short. She took a sharp intake of breath.
I lead where the others cannot follow. Divided we left, united we shall return.
She gave a slight bow, which only seemed to include her neck and head. Then she said something in a tongue none of them knew, and the other mages relaxed their stances.
Follow me, she who knows the old saying.
With that, she turned and began walking down the path, heading deeper into the forest.